Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 47 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to Go History, where I guide you through the most remarkable journeys of the past, expeditions that continue to shape our understanding of the world today. In this true story, we accompany 17-year-old German Georg Forster as he travels around the globe with his father, a naturalist aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. In this part of the journey, we find ourselves in the lush, spiritually rich environment of Raiatea, an island in the heart of Polynesia. Here, Georg and his companions encounter not only fascinating customs but also a deeply rooted belief system. Forster's account is written in the language of his time, but I've translated it into modern English for clarity. His insights reflect the knowledge of the late 18th century, so throughout this podcast I'll provide additional context where needed to help you better understand this extraordinary world. What happened in the last episode? On the island of Raiatea, the crew of the Resolution immersed themselves once again in the vibrant society of the Society Islands. They witnessed elaborate dance performances, observed complex local customs around gender roles, hospitality, and rituals, especially those linked to the Ereois, a prestigious but controversial religious order known for both their artistry and their taboo practice of infanticide. Maheine, their young Tahitian companion, found himself caught between admiration and alienation, respected in Tahiti, yet burdened by familiar expectations on Raiatea. The episode culminated with a long-anticipated visit to Matavai, a Tataorero, one of the island's scholars of religion and tradition. Georg and his father deeply engaged with him, and Matavai began to explain the intricate and varied Polynesian pantheon, where each island had its own supreme deity and cosmological narratives. This enlightening encounter set the stage for a deeper exploration of Polynesian theology and oral tradition in the upcoming episode. Friday, June 3rd, 1774, Raiatea.
That the Tahitian moon goddess bore little resemblance to the chaste Diana of antiquity, and much more to the Phoenician Astarte, was something readers would hardly dispute. The stars, they believed, had been created by a goddess named Tetu Mataro. The winds, in contrast, were under the command of a god called Ori Ori. In addition to these higher deities, they believed in many others of lesser rank. Some of them were said to bring misfortune, or even kill people in their sleep. These were worshipped at the principal Marae, stone temple platforms, through the Tahoa Rahai. The island's high priest prayers were offered to the benevolent gods, though not spoken aloud. Instead, they were indicated only through movements of the lips. During this, the priest looked toward the sky, and it was believed that the Eatua, that is, the god, descended to him and spoke with him, though remaining invisible to the people and understandable only to the priest. This was clear evidence of religious deception, whose goal had always been to veil religion in mystery. And in this very fact lay, for Georg, the strongest proof of the divine origin of Christianity. This religion stood in complete opposition to all others on precisely that point. It rejected all human-made delusions and gave the mind freedom to examine and question. Its original purity was incompatible with ornate disguises and was not wrapped in dark mysteries, which usually served only to conceal contradictions. Instead, it shone with a clear and enduring light by its own power. The true and worthy servants of this teaching had always declared and shown that no exclusive knowledge was granted to them, but that the same understanding was open to all who prayed sincerely, regardless of their status, for all should know God, from the greatest to the least. The offerings made to the gods of these islands consisted of cooked pork, chicken, and various other foods. The lower deities, especially the evil spirits, were honored merely through a kind of hissing sound. Some of these spirits were said to enter houses at night and kill the inhabitants. Others, they believed, dwelled on a certain uninhabited island called Niue, taking the form of large, powerful men with terribly glowing eyes, who devoured anyone who came too close to their shores. This story, however, did not seem to belong directly to their religious doctrine, but rather appeared to be a reference to cannibals, who, as Georg had previously noted, had likely existed on these islands in a very early period. Captain Cook had made an important discovery regarding the religious order of the islanders, one that Georg had not become aware of during their stay in the South Seas. For that reason, he did not wish to delay in sharing it, for the benefit of the reader, in Cook's own words. "Since I had good reason to suspect," said Captain Cook, "that the Tahitian religion, in some cases, demanded human sacrifice, I once went with Captain Fourneau to a Marae, that is, a burial site in Matavai. And, as I always did on such occasions, I brought one of my men who understood the local language fairly well. A few natives, including one who seemed quite intelligent, accompanied us. On the site stood a tupapau, a raised platform on which a dead body lay, together with some food, something that piqued my curiosity. I began asking short questions. For example, were the bananas and other fruits offerings to the Eatua, the deity? Were pigs, dogs, chickens, etc., offered to the Eatua? To all of these, the answer was yes. Then I asked, were human beings also offered to the Eatua? My interpreter immediately replied, Ta'ata ino, that is, wicked people were sacrificed, after being beaten to death beforehand. Tiparahai. I asked further whether good, decent people were ever killed in this way. The answer was no, only Tata ino. I wanted to know whether Arius, the nobles, were ever sacrificed. The response, they had pigs to offer to the Eatua, and the man stuck firmly to his answer that only wicked people were sacrificed. To be completely sure, I asked whether an honest, blameless Tautau, a man of the common people, who had neither pigs, nor dogs, nor chickens, would be sacrificed to the Eatua. Yet, time and again, I received the same answer. Only the wicked were offered. After further questioning, I came to believe that humans were sacrificed to the gods for certain crimes and vices, when they could not be ransomed or otherwise released. Such individuals, it seemed, were likely found almost exclusively among the lowest classes of the population. The man Cook questioned attempted to describe the entire ceremony, but they did not yet have sufficient command of the language to fully understand him. Later, Georg learned from Omai that they did in fact offer human sacrifices to the Supreme Being. According to Omai, everything depended on the high priest. When the people were assembled, the priest would enter the house of the god alone and remain there for a while. Upon emerging, he would declare that he had seen and spoken with the great god, a privilege reserved solely for the high priest. And that god, he said, had demanded a human sacrifice. He would then name the person chosen to suffer the grim fate, presumably always someone the priest disliked. The individual was killed on the spot. And if necessary, Omai believed, the priest would certainly be cunning enough to convince the people that the man had been a wicked person. Georg took issue with only one part of Captain Cook's account. The phrase that the high priest had seen the god did not align with Tahitian theology, in which the deity was considered invisible. Most likely, Cook had simply misunderstood the expression. Otherwise, this account of the sacrificial rituals agreed well with Georg's earlier suspicion, that the Tahitians may once have practiced cannibalism. It was well known that among many peoples, such barbarism gave rise to the custom of human sacrifice. And even as culture advanced and morals improved, the religious ceremony often continued to persist for a long time. Thus, even the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and the Romans had once offered human sacrifices to their gods, despite having already reached a high level of culture. Besides these sacrifices, certain plants were also consecrated to the deities. That was why trees like the casuarina, the coconut palm, and the banana plant were often planted beside the Marae. A species of Crateva, the pepper root, Hibiscus populneus, Dracaena terminalis, and Calophyllum were also found there and were generally considered symbols of peace and friendship. Various species of birds were likewise sacred to the gods, among them a type of heron, the kingfisher, and the cuckoo. However, as Georg had already mentioned, these birds were not revered in the same way by all people. Moreover, each island seemed to regard a different species as sacred. The priests of this people held their position for life, and their dignity was hereditary. The high priest of each island was always an ere, and ranked just below the king. He was consulted on all important matters and received a generous share of the land's goods. In short, they had succeeded in making themselves indispensable. Alongside the priests, there were also one or two teachers in each district, called tataorero, like Tutawai, who were knowledgeable in the doctrines of the gods and of creation, and who taught the people at certain times. These same individuals also ensured that the nation's knowledge of geography, astronomy, and timekeeping was not lost. They counted 14 months and named them in the following order: O Pororomwa, O Pororomri, Mureha, Uhi Ea, O Wireyama, Taoa, O Wiri Erebere, O Teare, Otetai, Warehu, Wahau, Pipiri, E Ununu. The first 7 months together were called Uru, the breadfruit season. How they adjusted these months to form a complete year remained a mystery to the Europeans. It could be assumed that certain months, such as the 2nd and 7th, were intercalary months, since their names closely resembled the 1st and 5th. If so, they would have had to be inserted at specific intervals. Each month consisted of 29 days. During the last two, they said the moon was dead, as it could no longer be seen. From this, it followed that they did not count the beginning of the month from the actual conjunction, but from the first visible appearance of the moon. The 25th day of their 13th month, E Ununu, corresponded to June 3rd, the very day on which Georg and his companions gathered this information. The Tahitian word for teacher, tahoa, was also given to those who understood the healing powers of plants used here to treat various illnesses. Yet it quickly became clear that this knowledge was limited in scope. They knew of only a few diseases and required only a small number of simple remedies. Hardly had the learned Tutawai brought his lesson to an end when the anchors were raised. On June 4th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, they departed from the island. The king of Raiatea, Uru, who had retained the title and outward honors of royal dignity from the conqueror Opuni, visited them one last time with several of his relatives as they prepared to set sail. Orea also came aboard with his family. Maheine, too, arrived with his kin to say goodbye. The scene was deeply moving. The people wept from the heart, none more bitterly than poor Maheine. The young man seemed nearly crushed by the weight of his sorrow. He rushed from one cabin to the next, embracing everyone without being able to utter a word. His sobs, his looks, and his tears defied description. As the ship finally began to sail, he had to tear himself away and climb down into his boat. While all his fellow islanders had already taken their seats, he remained standing. He gazed after them, without looking away. At last, he lowered his head and buried his face in his garment. Even when they were far beyond the coral reef, he was still reaching out his hands toward them, until he could no longer be seen.
Saturday, June 4th, 1774, off the coast of Raiatea, Society Islands, South Pacific.
And so they left behind a warm-hearted people who, despite all their imperfections, were perhaps more innocent and pure of heart than many others who had advanced further in education and refinement. These people understood the virtues and duties of social life, and they consistently lived by them. The kindness of heart that the honest Maheine showed on every occasion was a fairly accurate measure of the character of the entire population. Georg had often seen how many of them would fraternally share a single breadfruit or a few coconuts, satisfied with the smallest portion themselves so that no one would go without. And this helpful unity was by no means limited to small things. Just as readily as they shared food, they also gave each other clothing or objects of greater value, with the same willingness and selflessness. Even with them, strangers in their land, the islanders were unfailingly warm and generous. Whenever the travelers wished to go ashore from the boats or return from land to the boats, the islanders would always offer to carry them on their backs so that their feet stayed dry. Often, they would carry the bartered goods afterwards. Most of the time, they were even willing to wade into the water like retriever dogs to fetch the birds they had shot. If the men were caught in the rain or became too exhausted from the heat to go on, they were invited to rest in the huts and were served the best food available. The hospitable host would then modestly stay at a distance and touch nothing until explicitly asked to help himself. Others in the household would fan the guests with leaves or branches to provide a breeze. When it was time to leave, the visitors were usually welcomed as part of the family, depending on their age, either as father, brother, or son. They did this under the belief that officers and their companions must surely be related to one another, just as the leaders and high-ranking individuals on the Society Islands were all considered one single family. This mistake led them to believe that Captain Cook and Georg's father were brothers. For all their practical wisdom, they were not particularly good judges of character. What made their virtues, hospitality, warmth, and selflessness, even more admirable was the fact that they were hardly aware of them themselves, leaving it to the strangers to preserve their memory in grateful tribute. Upon their departure from Raiatea, they fired a few cannons in honor of His Majesty the King's birthday. For the islanders, it was a new and impressive spectacle. During the 6 weeks they spent on Tahiti and the Society Islands, they had recovered well. The men were fully healed from scurvy and gall disorders. In return, however, several sailors began showing symptoms of venereal disease. Nearly half of the crew was affected. Still, the illness was overall less aggressive than in Europe. Maheine had often assured them that this disease had already been widespread in Tahiti and the Society Islands before Captain Wallis arrived in 1768. He even explicitly claimed that his own mother had died from it years earlier on Bora Bora. Thus, the origin of its outbreaks in different regions of the world had clearly been misunderstood. For nearly 300 years, European moralists had blamed the Spanish because their doctors believed the disease had been brought from America. Yet it was now undeniable that it had already been known in Europe before the discovery of the New World. Just as hastily, British and French sailors had blamed one another for bringing the disease to the kind-hearted Tahitians, although the islanders had long been affected and even had their own methods of treatment. What was even more remarkable, the poison of the disease seemed already weakened and milder here, just as it is today in South America. In such epidemics, this weakening usually only sets in after a longer period of devastation. Still, the healthy climate and the simple diet of the islanders may well have played a significant role, too. Georg, however, was far from believing that the disease had been carried from Europe to America. No, he believed that the same causes which led to its emergence on one continent could just as well bring it forth on another. The sailors' excesses with women on Tongatabu and the Marquesas Islands, even their dealings with the prostitutes on Easter Island, had no ill consequences. One might conclude from that those islands were not yet affected. Georg deliberately said might, for as convincing as such conclusions might seem, they could still be deceptive. Captain Wallis's case was a good example. He had left Tahiti without a single sailor on his ship having caught a venereal disease, even though it had already been spreading on the island. That the disease had already existed among the New Zealanders before any contact with Europeans was also something that could hardly be denied.
In the 18th century, European sailors reported outbreaks of venereal diseases among their crews during their stays on Tahiti and other islands in the South Seas. At the time, they assumed that these diseases, especially syphilis, had already widespread among the local populations long before Europeans arrived on the islands. As evidence, they cited statements from islanders claiming that earlier generations had already been affected. Based on these assumptions, they drew far-reaching conclusions. Syphilis may not have been introduced to the South Seas by European sailors at all, but might have developed there independently. From today's perspective, we know that these conclusions were mostly incorrect, but they were understandable given the state of knowledge at the time. In the 18th century, there was no microbiology, no clear understanding of transmission pathways, and no reliable diagnostics. Symptoms like skin rashes, genital ulcers, or general malaise could be attributed to a wide range of diseases, including leprosy, yaws, or other tropical infections that resemble syphilis but are not sexually transmitted. It wasn't until the discovery of the syphilis pathogen Treponema pallidum in 1905 and the development of serological tests that it became possible to clearly identify infections. Today, studies show that syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases were in fact introduced to the South Seas with the arrival of European ships. The claim that the disease had already existed there is therefore highly questionable from a medical point of view. It is likely that other illnesses were misidentified as syphilis, or that the statements of islanders were mistranslated or misunderstood. Another common misconception was the observation that syphilis took a milder course in the South Seas than in Europe. From today's standpoint, this can be explained by natural variations in the course of the disease, genetic factors, or different co-infections, not by a weakened island strain of the pathogen, as was assumed at the time. Climate conditions or the islanders' diet may have influenced symptoms, but not the disease itself. Historical texts also often claim that certain islands, such as Tonga or the Marquesas, remained free of disease. This, too, must be viewed critically today. Syphilis has an incubation period of several weeks. Sailors who became infected may not have shown symptoms until they had already moved on, or transmission may have gone unnoticed. As for the origin of syphilis, the so-called Columbus hypothesis is considered the most likely today. According to this theory, the disease was brought to Europe by sailors returning from the first American expedition in 1493. It then spread rapidly across the continent. Earlier theories suggesting that the disease had already existed in Europe cannot be supported by modern molecular biology. It is therefore widely accepted that syphilis originated on the American continent and spread globally through transatlantic contact during colonization. Today it is clear. The spread of sexually transmitted infections in the South Seas was a direct consequence of colonial contact, marked by extreme power imbalances, a lack of knowledge about infection prevention, and deep cultural misunderstandings. Statements like those from Georg Forster or Captain Wallace are valuable historical sources, but they do not reflect the medical realities as we understand them today.
In the afternoon, they passed the island of Marae and continued westward with a strong trade wind. At 6 o'clock in the morning, they sighted the island that Captain Wallace had named Lord Howe's Island. It consisted of low reefs and had a lagoon in the center. Based on its position, it had to be the very island known among the inhabitants of the Society Islands as Mapeha. According to their observations, it lay at 16 degrees 46 minutes south latitude and 154 degrees 8 minutes west longitude. A few pelicans and boobies were seen nearby, but there was no sign of people. The island appeared to be completely uninhabited. The next day, around noon, the wind shifted and began blowing against them. All afternoon there were thunder, lightning, and at times heavy downpours. During the night, the wind died down completely. However, since the heat lightning continued, they secured the electric chain to the top of the mast as a precaution.
In the 18th century, knowledge about electricity was still very limited. But it was already understood that lightning was a form of electrical discharge, and that it could seriously damage ships or even set them on fire. During this time, the idea began to spread of using metallic conductors to channel lightning strikes in a controlled way. Benjamin Franklin had also conducted research in this area. Captain James Cook had a so-called electric chain installed at the top of the mast on the HMS Resolution, a metallic conductor that extended from the masthead down into the sea. In the event of a lightning strike, it was meant to direct a current through the metal, preventing the ship's wooden structure from catching fire or crew members from being injured. Cook's use of this early lightning protection system shows how practical reason and scientific curiosity came together in his expeditions, and how scientific thinking asserted itself even under the demanding conditions of a voyage around the world.
Over the next 3 days, the wind was so weak that they made barely any progress. At times, it was completely undetectable. During these calms, they at least found enjoyment in the many tropical birds and sooty terns circling the ship. During that time, the sailors also caught a large shark on the line, but to their great frustration, it managed to escape, even though they had shot it 3 times in the belly to make sure it wouldn't get away. On the morning of June 11th, the wind picked up again and carried them west-southwest. But after 2 days, they once again had to deal with shifting winds and headwinds. At night, there was frequent lightning. Both in the air and in the sea, there was much movement during this period. Seabirds of all kinds swarmed around the ship. Bonitos, mahi-mahi, sharks, and right whales accompanied them on their journey. At 8 o'clock in the morning on June 16th, they sighted another flat island. Around 3 in the afternoon, they drew closer and sailed all the way around it, but found no anchorage or harbor. The island consisted of several small islets, connected by reefs. They were covered with trees, mainly coconut palms, which gave the little landmass a very charming appearance. Seabirds swarmed around the island in such numbers that they rightly assumed it was completely uninhabited. In some places, the shore was sandy, just the kind of spot where turtles like to lay their eggs. The surrounding sea was rich in delicious fish. They named this pretty little island Palmerston Island. It lay at 18 degrees 4 seconds south latitude and 165 degrees 10 seconds west longitude. After 4 days of sailing west-southwest, they spotted a slightly hilly island in the afternoon of the 20th. Before sunset, they could already make out trees on it. As the land lay close, they tacked through the night against the wind. Only at daybreak did they turn again toward the coast and sailed along it at a distance of about 4 kilometers. The shoreline was steep and rocky throughout, but at the foot of the cliffs there were occasional narrow strips of sand. The island appeared low-lying, and even at its highest points it barely rose 12 meters above sea level. Still, it was covered with forest and smaller shrubs. Around 10 o'clock, they spotted 7 or 8 people walking along the shore. They appeared dark-skinned and were naked, wearing only white cloths around their heads and hips. Each held either a spear, a club, or a paddle in hand. In some crevices in the cliffs, they saw numerous small canoes pulled up onto the land. Low-growing coconut palms covered the slopes of the cliffs. That was invitation enough for them to go ashore. 2 armed and manned boats were launched. The captain, Dr. Sparman, Mr. Hodges, Georg's father, and Georg himself went along. A coral reef ran along the coast, but there was an opening where the surf was less dangerous. There they landed, climbed the nearest rocky point, and stationed a group of sailors and marines. This rocky outcrop consisted entirely of sharp-edged, broken formations and was covered with small shrubs, like those often found on low islands. Alongside familiar species, they also discovered some new plants sprouting from the cracks in the glassy rock, even though not a single grain of soil could be seen. Among the birds they found were whimbrels, snipes, and herons, species similar to those on Tahiti. They had made their way about 150 meters inland through the brush when they heard the islanders calling loudly. That made them turn back at once to the rocky point where the sailors were positioned. There, Captain Cook reported that he himself had caused the outcry. He had followed a deep but dry gully, likely formed by rainwater, which led him further inland. But just as he reached the edge of the forest, a sudden sound startled him, as if someone had fallen from a tree. Assuming it had been one of their own, Captain Cook had called out to show that he was nearby. But instead of the expected answer, a local replied to his call, and he realized his mistake. He thought it wiser to turn back. From there, they called out to the islanders in every South Sea language they knew, telling them they had come as friends and asking them to come down to the shore. After some time of hearing them speak among themselves and calling back and forth, one of them finally appeared at the entrance of the streambed or gully. His upper body was painted black down to the waist. He wore a headdress with upright feather tufts and held a spear in his hand. Behind him, many voices could be heard echoing in the hollow, but the trees blocked the view of the others. Soon after, a second man jumped beside him, apparently much younger, beardless, and painted black, just like his companion. In his right hand, he held a long bow, similar to the ones they had seen on Tongatabu. The moment they caught sight of him, he hurled a large stone with his left hand in their direction, and with such accuracy that, despite a distance of at least 50 meters, Dr. Sparman suffered a severe bruise to the arm. Georg's friend was driven by the sharp pain the stone had caused into an impulsive reaction. In a burst of anger, he fired a scatter shot at his opponent, fortunately without hitting him. The two islanders then disappeared and did not return, even though the men remained in place for a while longer to perform the symbolic ritual of taking possession. Eventually, they returned to the boats and rowed along the coast. They paid no mind to the islanders, who reappeared on the rocky cliff they had previously occupied shortly after the group had left. The coastline remained unchanged throughout, making it difficult to find another suitable landing site. But no sooner had they gone ashore again than the men in the boat shouted that they could see armed islanders standing atop the rocky bluff. The others were just beginning to climb. They had no choice but to row on, until they reached a spot where a wide opening broke through the steep rocky shore, offering slightly easier access to the interior. About 50 meters from the shore, a shallow reef stretched along the coast, with several passages allowing the boat to pass through. On this reef, the Marines formed a line for cover, while the captain and his companions advanced along the hollow path ahead of them. There they discovered 4 canoes lying on the beach. They resembled those of Tongatabu in structure and bore some carvings, though overall they were more simply built and less carefully crafted. The outriggers were made of thick poles. Some boats had roofs made of mats, under which lay fishhooks, spears, and small wooden pieces, apparently used as torches for night fishing. In each of these boats, the captain placed some glass beads, nails, and medals as gifts for the owners. While he was still busy doing this, Georg noticed a group of islanders coming down the hollow path, and they all stepped back a few paces. 2 of these men, also painted black and wearing feathered headdresses, came running toward them with wild cries, brandishing their spears menacingly. Their shouts in a friendly tone had no effect. The captain tried to fire his weapon, but it misfired. He then asked the others to shoot as well, given the immediate danger. But their guns, too, failed, just like his. Emboldened by this apparent helplessness, the islanders hurled 2 spears. One nearly struck Captain Cook, who ducked just in time. The other flew so close to Georg's hip that the black paint smeared his clothing. After several failed attempts, Georg's gun finally went off. Though it was only loaded with shot, it still hit his attacker. Hodges's bullet, on the other hand, had no effect. This shot triggered the unit stationed on the reef to open a proper volley of fire. They had noticed that a second group of islanders was trying to approach from another path to cut off their retreat. But Georg's scatter shot, fired at the two leading warriors, thwarted that plan. The rest then dared no further attack, giving the group time to regroup with their comrades. As long as a single islander remained in sight, they kept the fire going. Two of them showed particular determination. They had taken cover behind a bush and kept waving their spears without pause, even though their companions had long since fled. Finally, one of the two must have been wounded, because suddenly they both took off running with wild screams. They returned to the boats. They wanted nothing more to do with these people, since no pleading had been able to secure a friendly reception. Nature itself seemed to have destined this people for isolation, if only by making their island nearly inaccessible. Like all low islands, it was formed from a coral reef, and as far as they could see, it bore only a few coconut palms, with no other fruit trees in sight. However, they suspected that the island's interior was not so barren after all, and likely produced some nutritious plants. To Georg, it seemed entirely plausible that in the center there might be a fertile plain, formed by what had once been an inland lake, gradually dried out over time. Whether an earthquake or some other powerful change in the Earth's structure had caused such a large coral formation to be lifted about 12 meters above sea level, Georg preferred to leave that question for future scholars to resolve. The boats and weapons of the islanders bore a strong resemblance to those on Tongatabu, which led them to assume that the inhabitants of both islands shared a common origin. But the people on this island were few in number, very uncivilized, wild, and completely naked. The entire island was estimated to be just under 5 kilometers in length. It lay at 19 degrees 1 minute south latitude and 169 degrees 37 minutes west longitude, and they named it the Wild Islet. As soon as they were back at the ship, the boats were hauled in.
That brings us to the end of episode 47 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.